Hello, thank you, Professor Hollis Robbins, for joining today. We were chatting a bit before. I find the fact that you've had jobs outside of the university to be interesting. I mean, I'm one of these people that just went straight through, and anyway, I know why I did that, but I'm not. I don't think it's the best way to do it. Um,
Well, yeah, I was not expecting it. I didn't finish getting my PhD until about 40. Before that, I was in electoral politics, campaigns, speechwriting, fundraising. I grew up in New Hampshire, so I worked on pretty much everybody's presidential campaign through Clinton. I worked on Clinton 92 and 96. And then this was sort of before the internet was really getting started. And for some reason, I had decided that all the great things that I was writing for campaign statements and speeches were lost to the world, especially when you do it for a losing candidate. Not that Clinton was losing, he won, but I decided I wanted to go back and get a PhD in English literature. And then I liked teaching and I liked academia. And it's been fun. I mean, and I agree with you. When you're actually out in the world and you've got to change people's minds and get people to be excited about something, or even in the classroom, campaign experience really helps.
Yeah, I mean, being able to persuade while remaining persuadable. And
Don't you do
I,
that in the classroom?
yeah, I mean, actually, one of the things I try to do in my classes is to talk to students about that um, and just say to them, if everyone is only persuading, there's actually nobody left to change their mind. So, and I think the art of persuasion outside of our disciplinary sort of silos is a lost art for a lot of faculty because we within our own disciplines we have ways of fighting things out and know how things get resolved. But when you jump outside of that, I think we're often then frustrated. So.
Yeah, when when you're doing phone banking or walking doors, which is, how I started out, and you think your candidate is right, but you have to show yourself listening to some person, some retired guy who's screaming at you or this or that or the other, and you have to keep the smile on your face and say, "That's a great point. I will bring that back because I think my candidate is listening to that." Right? It's great practice for encouraging everybody to speak in a classroom. And, I don't think people are trained well to be able to, you know, uh, provide a space in the classroom for multiple voices and pluralistic voices. I was once years ago teaching a class in rhetoric where the final project was students standing up and giving a persuasive speech. And there was one young man who wanted to do a gun rights speech. And, a lot of the left people in the classroom were like, "You can't let him do that. You can't let him do that." And I said, "You know what? This is the point. You are the best audience for this." And, it ended up being wonderful. But I think, I talked to a bunch of my friends and they were like, "Don't let him do that. Talk him into something else." And I'm like, "No, that's not the point here." Anyway, it was good.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Yeah, so you have been a dean both at Sonoma State and then Utah Dean of Humanities, and now you're back focusing on cross-cutting issues in education and you're teaching and writing. So I just wonder, you wrote a Substack I think earlier in February, and you said that faculty better make sure they know what they know, that artificial intelligence
Right.
doesn't know about what they do. Tell us what you're thinking about there.
Sure. I mean, when you think about, and I don't know how much I'm assuming you've been playing a lot with some of the AI models that which ones
Yeah.
do you use, by the way?
We usually chat GPT, and there's an internal, there's some people I know that have got one at Duke that they've used. And one of the things that I have done is taken a traditional prompt from a class, like for example, I teach one of the classes I teach is practical ethics of public policy. So, give them a basic prompt and show them how ChatGPT had answered it, and then ask them, what did ChatGPT just do just as good as you could have done? What did it do better? What did it do worse? So I've tried to think about it as a tool that they had to understand rather than something to reflexively be scared of. I don't know. Is that a reasonable way
No,
to?
that's perfectly reasonable. So, I mean, it was easier for me given my scholarship, which is I focus primarily, most of my work has been on 19th century African American writers who have drawn on canonical Western canon for their work. Some of my best known work is on a writer, fugitive enslaved woman writer named Hannah Crafts, who wrote this wonderful novel called The Bondswoman's Narrative. Um, and she quoted and took passages and framing from Charles Dickens, from Walter Scott, from a number of people. Or you think about Frederick Douglass, who famously found a copy of the Columbian Orator in Fells Point, Baltimore, and drew upon that model of rhetoric for writing his famous narrative. Well, when the history of African American literature was, canonized in universities, and predominantly white universities, after being protested into existence in the 1960s, a very particular version of Black poetry became the norm, where from Amiri Baraka, it was, sort of deracinated and created its own thing. And that's how it has been taught. I say that because my scholarship is about underacinating, rerouting African American literature in the sources, the Western canon, where many of the writers learn to write and craft their narratives. I say that because AI has, when it's been sweeping the internet and doing all the things for the training data for the large language models, has one narrative about Black poetry, and that's the standard narrative of Black arts. And so the first prompt I ever do when I try out a new LLM is I say something like, from my last book, tell me a little bit about the African American sonnet tradition, about which I probably know more than anybody on the planet. There's maybe two other people who know as much as I do. And I know so much more than the AI knows. And so just to be able to show somebody that, like, in fact, this is all wrong, what the AI does is give you kind of the standard narrative of anything. Any subject you want, it'll give you sort of the prevailing view, the what do they call, the mind hive, or hive mind,
Hive mind,
the
yeah.
hive mind, right? So fine, if you want to just know what the hive mind is about something, go ahead. But if you're going to be paying money to go to a university, you actually should be paying for what's outside the hive mind. If you're paying for the hive mind, shame on you and shame on the university, right? So it
Yes,
moves.
shame if that's all they're delivering.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think a lot, and I've been writing a lot about general education courses, because general education courses are about, the minimum standard of what you should know about biology, about American institutions, about how to write, about, how a bill becomes a law, how a cell divides, right? There's a kind of overlap between hive mind and the general education canon. And so my two larger points have been, how do we think about, what is known and what could easily be delivered through AI in that kind of general education, hive mind kind of, knowledge base. And then what you should actually be charging tuition for, which is what you said, what you know that it doesn't know. And I'm sure you have tons of stuff that it doesn't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. So maybe there's a paradox, I think, in that, because there's this, well, in some quarters there's this notion of, we're de-emphasizing humanities, or we're not investing. But if we thought of, for example, biology that's going to be on the MCAT, that is something that's a set of knowable and known things, and maybe the hive mind AI, maybe that could actually be delivered. Whereas what you are talking about, rediscovering the creative process that really was 19th century African American literature really cannot be. It kind of actually it's interesting. That's interesting to me because it kind of flips on its head what I think a lot of people, I don't know if it's a lot of people, some people assume about what is valuable and not in the modern university.
Well, and I think I don't know what your gen ed is at Duke, but I know a lot about North Carolina's, I know Utah's, I know California's. I'll talk a little bit about the California idea that there's a shared gen ed of about 40 units, I think, 40 credits across community colleges, the Cal State system, and the UC system. And the idea is you've got to take these particular things, writing, natural sciences, social sciences, intro to humanities, blah, blah, blah. And it's a sort of, it has been these sort of large articulated state mandated agreements that it doesn't matter where you have taken the class. You could take it at a community college, you can take it at Berkeley. They are, in the eyes of the state, the same class. Now, whatever, but what that says is that the teacher doesn't matter, right? So you could have somebody who is a very good teacher teaching a 5-5 load, or not a very good teacher at a community college teaching a class, or somebody at the Cal State system who is also moonlighting at a community college teaching that class, or a grad student at Berkeley who's going to be, the top scholar of her generation teaching that class,
Right.
right? The state says it doesn't matter. Now, if the state has already said it doesn't matter, why don't we deliver it by AI,
Hmm. Interesting.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, that's a great point. I think at Duke, Duke is, I love Duke. It's my 29th year there. But also, I went to Carolina undergrad, and that's where my PhD is from. So I've got some skepticism about, just, well, I'm just a kid from North Carolina who went to UNC, who's now a professor at Duke. It's kind of a weird
Right,
background. But yeah, I think I know Duke has of what to me is a somewhat complex system of figuring out whether summer school credits
right,
can be transferred
right,
back. So Duke might be at the other end of the spectrum
right.
on that sort of thing. And I guess maybe that just comes with the territory of a private university.
Right. I used to do that at Johns Hopkins when I was a faculty there at the Peabody Institute. People would come in with all sorts of places where they took a summer class or whatever, and you'd call up and you'd get the syllabus and you'd look at the quality of the teacher, and it was a kind of like,
Right.
okay, this seems all right. And that's fine. There should be some sort of faculty members looking at it and saying, did this person learn this thing?
Right.
That's called like the learning outcome, right? Did you learn what the class said you were going to learn? And the bureaucracy involved in saying, yes, this person did this, the bureaucracy is the problem, right? Because the individual labor involved should be labor. When you turn this into check boxes,
Right.
right, then it's a performance. And I've been talking to a number of faculty members, again, thinking about if we had AI delivering the gen ed curriculum in California, it would save millions of dollars. It would save millions of dollars per year of faculty members going through this performance and then going through the performance of checking a box to teach things that are already known to AI, that spending 20 hours of the student and figuring out how to evaluate that the student learned might be more efficient for everybody. The pushback is from faculty members saying, well, you're socializing these young people like you were socialized as a kid from Carolina, right? You're being
Right.
socialized into higher ed, and that is what we're paying these faculty members for. But
Right.
That's actually not true if the state says we don't care. To be
Right.
socialized into Berkeley and to be socialized into community college or socialized here are completely different things, right? So,
But because you're giving the same credit hours to the
right,
yeah. So then that would is what you are imagining then that uh, we could over time reduce maybe both the time invested and also the actual the cash flow, the price point,
yep,
and students would do general ed on I don't know, sort of their own kind of pace, and
right,
then maybe they'd come for 2 years for
right.
on campus, that type of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Having a 3-year degree where somebody saved, a great deal of money taking online through some sort of portal, the gen ed curriculum. So, again, when you think about, okay, so you teach a class, you said, what are the classes you teach, ethics or?
One of the classes, it's called Policy Choices Value Conflict, which nobody really knows what that means, but it's practical ethics of public policy, and it's a core course, but each faculty member puts it together as they wish. So that's a weird way to do a core course, but
No,
that's what we do.
right. But the point is they're paying for your expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. It
Right.
gets to your, it's, yeah,
They're
yeah,
paying for you and they're paying
it's
for
the,
what you know, right?
right.
And that's totally fine. So then let me, at the end of the semester, if they have a case study or a paper or some project, how do you say this student knows what I said that they were going to know at the end of the semester? And that's your what used to be called your grade, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, like, so I'll tell you this past semester, what I had them do was I asked the students, I put them into groups and asked them to develop an intellectual charter for Duke University for undergraduate
Excellent.
students. And I tried to keep it extremely open-ended because I said I did not want to tell them what
Mhm.
that meant, what to do.
Yep.
They absolutely hated it. They hated it, hated it, hated it.
Excellent.
And they're like, oh, what do you mean? And, they were thinking they had to figure out
Mhm.
what I thought they should write so I could then do the check. And, finally, um, I finally gave them some more guidance and they end up doing a great job. And they had a small part of the grade where they graded one another in terms of how
That's
they
great.
worked on it. And then I ended up I really blew um, the Sanford School has a set of grade inflation targets where we kind of have a governor, and I just blasted them, and the students all did a really good job, and so and they were group projects, so I'm sure within there were students who did more or less, but what I tried to tell them is, welcome to the rest of your life. So
Right.
that's how I did it. I'm not
See, and let me tell you why I'm 100% in favor of that. First of all, labor intensive, but that's what students are paying for at Duke. They're paying for your expertise and your labor. When you outsource that to a bureaucracy and you say, no, it's not about you, faculty member, it's about the class, the curriculum and the learning outcomes, and we're going to standardize this, right? So some of if you, I don't know how much you know about the history of learning outcomes because you've been primarily at Duke in a private, but it really they came out of the EU and I think it's the Barcelona Accords in 1999. So once people could transfer back and forth between Spain and France and whatever Italy, if you take intro chemistry in one university, does it
right.
mean more or less the same thing? And whether or not that is instantiated again at lower levels, that's fine. And it's nice to be able to say somebody can transfer. But we've got this entire monstrosity of a bureaucracy designed for easy transfer. Okay. And that means it's not designed for you, right? And so if somebody takes your class as a sophomore, perhaps, even though it's your upper level classes, right, and wanted to transfer.
No, no, this the class I was telling you about is freshmen and sophomores. Yeah.
Okay, but it would be hard for somebody else to say, what is this strange thing? And the thing is, so what if it's hard? is what I'm saying. We've got this monstrosity built on legibility across, right? Across everything, which means it takes a lot of individuality out of classes. It takes a lot of innovation out. So probably the most controversial thing I could say to you publicly here is the decimation of what's happening of the in the Department of Education statistics will end up giving more power back to individual faculty. There'll be more labor, right? Less legibility, but we'll be going back to an era where actually the faculty member judges whether you've learned something.
Hmm, interesting. Um, so I was thinking I grew up in Eastern North Carolina and spent my summers on tobacco farms
Excellent.
and so when I showed up at UNC, there's something great to me about a public university. And I'm not saying Duke's not great, but there's something great about just this mass humanity of students showing up and coming, churning out at the end that pleases me, I think. And my freshman year, my teaching assistant in intro, like U.S. government, was a fellow who was the child of missionaries who grew up in Rhodesia, then became Zimbabwe, and he taught us about apartheid during the study sections, which is not what he was supposed to be doing. But I had never heard the word apartheid, and I don't know if I should be embarrassed about that or whatever, but I just didn't know about it. And then one day, he built a shanty town on the campus, and they were talking about divestment, and it's got sunshine laws, and they declared it closed, and he handcuffed himself to the chancellor.
Excellent.
Now, I'm not sure what would happen today if you handcuffed yourself to the chancellor of UNC. It would not be good, I don't think. But and it just the thing about that for me, it was part of igniting my interest in learning
Mhm.
because I was thinking, man, that guy, he is serious business about things that he has learned and he wants to change the world.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't know. I don't know what that means for reform of education, but it was just this,
Yes,
UNC has a protest culture of doing kind of
right.
wild stuff like that. It's just part of the place.
No, but it's what you just said is central, right? It is, you made the point better than I did just now about the centrality of the individual faculty member to the educational enterprise. You cannot scale that, right? So I'm in all these meetings, being at a big public, and when I was a dean, all these meetings, it's like we have to invent the first year experience at where we, give a first year experience and we then can scale it up for 1 million students around the country and we will have solved the first year experience problem. Now, your story was a fantastic story of a first year experience, right? I mean, you can't scale that. You can't predetermine that. What you can do is hire excellent faculty, period, right? That know things that even now he would know things that AI doesn't do. I'm all, similarly, I mean, rural New Hampshire, did a lot of time picking apples, not tobacco. But came to Johns Hopkins, a private, as a freshman with no idea about the world and culture. I didn't know that people walking around with little alligators on their shirts. IZOD hadn't really made it to my rural part of New Hampshire. Anyway, I had a faculty member, Dick Maxey, as a freshman, who had a visiting scholar in Renee Girard, and basically gave the class over to Renee Girard, who sat and lectured us in French about French post-structuralism. And I had no idea what he was talking about. All I knew is it sort of blew my mind. Like, you know, I have no idea what's going on here, and isn't college cool?
Yeah.
Right. And, I'm sure today, right, I might have gone to my advisor or had mandated meetings with my advisor, and maybe I complained that I might have complained that my French wasn't quite up to it or this or that. Um, and something bad would have happened. And and I
Yeah,
just think, I'll take it the way it was. And I understand that that's old fashioned. And I understand that there was a lot of bad things, without oversight and, harassment and discrimination and all the things that we are living in a better world because. But we're not living a better world because of the bureaucracy. We're living a better world because we're having better conversations about about respect. But I think the bureaucratization and the way you started this conversation about, or maybe this is before we went on camera, it's about students having perhaps thinking of themselves as customers rather than learners has been part of the problem.
yeah. Um, yeah, let's uh I wonder what you think in terms of um the proper role of protest on a campus. Like I think at Duke we're really well, I think we're struggling to um name the proper role because there are these historical protests that are celebrated,
Right.
like the takeover of the Allen building, but that's not what we want to have happen today. So it's like, why exactly are we celebrating it if it's not what we want to have happen
Right.
today? I just curious of I mean, to me, people protest when they don't feel like they can
Well,
participate.
what is,
And
and
so
the
it's a
thing, yeah, what are they protesting? And again, my field being African American studies, which is a field that, at least on white campuses, predominantly white universities, it was protested into existence in the
yes.
60s.
And that was one of the 1968 takeover of the
Right,
Allen building. One of the request, which
right.
was eventually heeded, was to create an African American
Right.
Studies
So you're
department.
protesting with a very particular set of requests and a very particular, you're protesting an administration to do something that the administration can do, right? And, again, I'll tell you some of that history leaves out the ways that Black history, African American studies were already doing very well at Fisk and Wilberforce and Howard. And it's not a new field, it's just a new field for some universities. And it was a good thing to protest that into existence. Um, yes, Vietnam War protests. At Johns Hopkins, we also had a shanty town for divestment, and again, asking universities to do certain things. The recent protests, it's a really interesting question. I tweeted a little something today, and I've written about being the dean. Under me, I had Jewish studies and Middle East studies. So
Mm.
the morning after, on October 8th, 2023, I texted the head of the Middle East Center, who had just taken over 4 months before, and I'm like, well, we're going to have a year ahead. And we were in daily contact, literally daily contact about how he was going to go about, running the Middle East Center in the years. And we ended up, uh, deciding that, especially by the end of the day, like within 24 hours, you saw protest lines and divisions happening on campus. What we were going to do is focus only on academics and only on the classroom. However, what we also did is decide that we would work with student affairs, because understanding that students might not be in a Middle East studies class, but would want, and again, I was drawing on my own sense of ignorance when I went off to college. I knew that there's a lot of students who didn't know the difference between Gaza and the West Bank, didn't know what Hamas didn't know what the Nakba was. So we did some panels for students and for student affairs and for resident advisors and dorm masters and things like that, so that you could ask those kinds of questions, right? And not just be caught up in, this is something we should protest, to turn the conversation into, this is something we can learn about. And so when the Middle East Center director, this fantastic guy named Chris Lowe, who was from Columbia, said, can I lecture on Hamas? And I'm like, of course you can lecture on Hamas, right? And of course you can lecture on the history, and of course you can lecture on on Osama bin Laden and Muslim Brotherhood and that those entire streams that go into the thinking. Of course you can do that. And we did it in the classroom. Now there was still in April, I think, some protests at Utah like everybody else, but they were not involving us. They were not involving the faculty. They were not involving anybody who was part of this conversation that we were going to bring things into the classroom. And this fall, in fact, we taught a class called The History of Israel and Palestine. And I spent $8,000 to have a panic button put into the classroom that was never needed, because we had created a culture where, when I was looking at, when we're all looking at what's happening in Colombia and every place else, it has not been a clear question of what is it that the protesters are asking of the administration. It didn't turn into divestment for about 6 to 8 months, if you remember. It was just protest.
Yeah. I was teaching this ethics of public policy class the fall of 2023, and October 7th was fall break started then, so the students were away and came back, and then we had my Thursday class, and then the next Tuesday, I brought the topic up, and we agreed as a class that because there was so much going on, and when I say we agreed, I suggested and sort of went along that we were going to alter the syllabus, and we were going to do some joint learning really, about this. And it was interesting to me because my remembrance of that is the students were glad that we were talking about it. And they said most of their classes had acted like it had not taken place. And they felt that was inappropriate given the magnitude of what had happened. People were like, I'm supposed to teach you about physics. And then part of me is like, if you're a physics professor, you may have I was being very cautious because I'm not an expert. I had taught, we had like a very small unit in the class, so I'd done some of this. So I think there might be really good reasons for the physics professor not to talk about this. And they might say, look, I have some personal views. I'm happy to have lunch, but we're actually going to talk about physics in this class. And I hope that you're getting this from somewhere else. So I don't know. One of the things I think we in the academy need to do a better job of, and this doesn't necessarily directly come out of talking about the Middle East, is just to have a little more humility the further away from our research expertise that we get.
Yeah, and what it is that, again, I think I've never been at an institution where you have the conversations before you need to have the conversations, right? The better, if I were in charge of everything, right, then I would spend a lot more time table gaming with deans and with chairs. To what happens when this tweet goes out? What happens when this happens? Like how do we talk about it? A place where a physics chair could say, I was talking to the, chair of Middle East Studies, and you know what, they're not going to get mad if we just talk about physics, right? Do you know what I mean? It's like, let's actually be able to talk about it before we talk about it. And granted, everybody's too busy, but if we actually got all the learning outcomes check boxes off their off their plates. But let me talk a little bit about academic freedom and protests. So I have a piece that just came out in the Georgetown Law and Public Policy Journal on the impossibility of one of the reasons I left the Cal State system was this new ethnic studies curriculum, which is mandated again across all of California. under a new ethnic studies definition, which says that within ethnic studies, talking about decolonization, colonization, anti-Semitism, it becomes a very international question. So that, and some of the biggest protesters in the past year and a half have come out of California ethnic studies curriculum, where they have said specifically, we have a right and responsibility to talk about Palestine, and Israel as a apartheid state, what have you. Now, again, if somebody's trained in Middle East studies or the history of the region, you know what, that is something that I can defend as a matter of academic freedom, and as a dean I would. But if your field is African American studies, I'm not going to be able to defend you if you say within my umbrella I need to be defended, like, Ta-Nehisi Coates going to the West Bank and saying this is Baltimore, or his book. Now, again, I'll defend anything he said in a class that's in the class of his training, but that's not everybody is an expert in that field, right? In Middle East studies, Middle East history. So when you say this entire umbrella over thousands of untrained faculty members in the California state system being able to have particular views that they're teaching only on Palestine, not on Israel, in classes that I would have to defend, I was like, I can't do that, because you're putting me in an impossible position.
Will you tell me, just to say a little more about what the ethnic studies curriculum is?
So it's there's a mandated ethnic studies curriculum that got passed and signed into law by Gavin Newsom in 2021. And it mandates that everybody in the Cal State system, and now that is extended to high school and to get into the CU system, has to take a class in ethnic studies. And the genesis of the bill was so that you could learn about one of four, and they specified four communities in California: Native American, Chinese American, Latin American, and Chicano, that history, and African American. And that Shirley Weber, who had been an African American studies professor and then became a congressman, state assemblyman, a woman, said this is going to be a requirement so that everybody could learn about these communities. Sounds great. Who doesn't like that? But you've got to have the faculty who are qualified to teach it. So if you're trained in Chicano studies, sure. And if you're trained in African American studies, sure, expertise matters. But under this umbrella, which then, and by the way, Armenians said, like, what about us? Jews, what about us? Sikhs, what about us? Other ethnicities, what about us? It's like, nope, you can't. Has to be these four. But when the ethnic studies umbrella and learning outcomes were developed within the state, and I spell this out in my piece, is all about you can teach about any of it. And you can teach decolonialism and the situation in Palestine. Not from Israel, because Israel is considered a religious study, not a ethnic studies. So it is structurally anti-Semitic.
I see. You mean in the way the
entire, and I'm not the first to mention it. I mean, there's been tons of people who said, you need to rewrite this curriculum. The reason I've written about it in the piece that I have coming out is about that I, as a dean who believes very strongly in academic freedom, to the fact that I'm sitting there on the phone with my Middle East studies director. It's like, I back you when you're giving lectures on Hamas and the Nakba, because that is your expertise. You have a PhD in that from Columbia. I will back you. I was not going to be able to support anybody in California.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. It's a larger question of where do faculty matter in higher ed right now? Right. And California has said in its public education system, whether at the level of gen ed or on the level of this or whatever, it's like faculty expertise does not matter to the state of California. And that's a problem.
And that's the essence of the problem. So is is it just, the billionth example of unintended consequence, or is it more fundamentally flawed than even that?
I think this is the conversation that I'd like to be having. And I think, again, I don't, I'm not a huge fan of what is happening in the White House right now. I'm not a huge fan of the chainsaw way of going about things. But I was wanting to have this conversation about the California public
Yeah.
education system from some time because it isn't working and it isn't attracting faculty. And the stories that you all you were telling and the stories that I hear everywhere are about faculty matter, how faculty matter. And so let me say one other thing, as long as I'm exercised about this, is when you look at the example of Arizona State University and Michael Crow and this whole new American university model, right, where it's breaking down traditional departments, breaking down silos, combining schools. So you have a school of global innovation and a BA in innovative environment or whatever, things like that, where you don't know the methodologies, you don't know the history of a discipline. You might have somebody who's a department chair or a dean who has no idea what anything is. His model is we have to teach generations of students to solve problems like climate change. And so we're going to give them classes in like BA in climate change or what have you. I don't know what they're called. You can go on the website.
Yeah.
They're nutty. And on the one hand, who's going to oppose that? It's like, wow, that's great. On the other hand, none of this has stopped protest activity at Arizona State. It's just as protest as anything. And if what you decide is the mission of the university is to train students for the future, then what you're saying is that faculty expertise doesn't matter.
Hmm. Yeah. So let's just one last topic and then we can wrap it up. So I think let's imagine that the Department of Education somehow it goes away. Um, what are the parts of what the Department of Education does for higher education that really need to be protected, and how do they need to be changed? Do you have any sense of this?
Well, it's a good question. There's part of uh, you know part of the concern, especially in at the turn of the century, has been about for-profit institutions, not just University of Phoenix, but these places that, are promising these degrees and charging a lot of money, and they don't mean anything. So part of what my concern about things like even learning outcomes. What do you know about CIP codes, CIP? The sort
Not
of,
too
no,
much.
it's okay. Like the Department of Education and the education statistics, they keep these not zip codes, but CIP codes, CIP, so that every I don't know what public policy is, that there's just kind of a list of these are the fields that we recognize as academic fields. And so when you start a new program, it has to be in these have these categories. So for example, film is a good example. Film was a fairly new major, right, in America. So you had to have a lot of times film programs were in creative writing programs or in some sort of journalism or media program until the Department of Education recognized film studies or filmmaking and film studies. Right now, there's a CIP code for video game under like education and engineering and computer science, but there isn't a CIP code for game studies, for kind of humanities. How do we think about the aesthetics of Assassin's Creed or this or that or the other? And there's a lot of good work that's being done, but you can't get a major in video game studies right now until the Department of Education agrees. So there's an example, kind of minor, but it's kind of major, right? Because you're not going to get federal funding if the Department of Education doesn't
Does
agree, right? So that there's kind of like the way that NIST, national
Yes.
whatever is, right?
Yeah.
Everybody should know what a minute is and a second is and a USB cord, and like there should be standards, and there should be baseline standards in education. And it is a good thing. As a libertarian, or grew up as a libertarian, that is a proper role for the government, is weights and measures. So that is something I don't want to see go away.
Mm. So interesting. Yeah. And then, of course, we got one thing I just want to bring up is I agree with you, like the issue of value of a degree. And one thing that I have just seen and recognized at Duke anyway is out of the financial crisis, there was an explosion of master's degrees.
Right.
Um, I don't know, I think about undergraduate is slightly different than graduate education, which to me, graduate education is much more, just really purely transactional. Um, but I just worry that, or I think we better make sure that we are not being predatory ourselves, against students. And so I think as some of the issues begin, if universities are about to have another period of budgetary difficulties, I just think we need to make sure we're doing the right thing by all of our students.
I think that's right. And I think, again, I urge, there's a lot of faculty members who get mad at me and say, like, that piece that I wrote,
Yeah,
it's later than you think about AI.
yeah, yeah.
I think there's a lot of money to be saved by, if you want students to get up to the speed on, like, I need you, before you go on to take upper level classes at our university, you need to know this, which we might have at one point in time depended on high school for, right? And I do think, though we don't have time for this now, the best thing that we could do for higher ed is have better high schools. Here's a place where, we would be rearranging the funding streams for higher ed. And because I agree with you, there are some masters that are perhaps not as worth it, and some faculty members that, that programs where you're charging $60,000 for a master's for a credential, which, may or may not be a good idea. But, if we make undergraduate costs less because we can actually have some of it be delivered by AI, I'm fine with that. It might change the cost structure and the revenue streams altogether.
So that's, yeah, just a,
Great.
a
So do you teach case studies? I
I'm
mean,
sorry. Yeah. So sometimes I also teach intro to public policy analysis, and we use often case studies that will evolve, and by that I mean you frame it, and you might start with a political discussion, and it might move towards a decision analysis or a cost benefit analysis, that
yeah,
type.
so I have a master's at, an expensive master's at
In the
from the
Kennedy
Kennedy
School, yeah,
School, right? And I had never done anything having to do with case studies as an undergrad, and it was fantastic,
yeah,
right? And, again, they're expensive. You can't
yeah,
just buy them but that's
right,
something that you could have an AI case study model unit that may be just as good, at least as anyway, we can,
yeah,
there are many new ways to do things, so.
okay. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank
Thank you
you.
for this conversation. I really love your work. I've been reading you for a while, so keep it up.
Thank you.